now head into our first session of the conference. May I request our session chair, Mr. M.J. Akbar, to formally introduce our panelists for the session: West Asia, Regional Realignment, Terrorism, Extremism, and Transnational Groupings. Our panelists include Dr. Michael Rubin, joining us online, Dr. P.R. Kumaraswamy, joining us online, Dr. Jonathan Fulton, Ambassador T.S. Tirumirti, Ambassador Mehmet Hasan Gogus. Could I please request all panelists to come on stage for the session? And all panelists are requested to please adhere to the time limit of 10 to 12 minutes at max. Thank you.
Welcome, friends, and to the session on the central conflict zone of the world, which is West Asia. And with me, in addition to Dr. Michael Rubin, who will be joining us online. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's worked in the Pentagon, and he's worked on the Middle East, and he's worked as a political advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority. For those who might not know what the Coalition Provisional Authority is, a well-disguised term for the American presence in Iraq. He writes frequently on Middle East. Maybe I should begin my remarks on the Middle East. South Asia, Africa, Taiwan, and American diplomacy. Dr. Kumaraswamy, he will also be online. He is a professor at the School of International Studies, JNU, a research fellow at the Harry Truman Research Institute, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He joined the JNU in September 1999. He has been researching and on various aspects of the contemporary, once again, Middle East. His works include India's Israel policy, published by Columbia Press, and A to Z of Arab-Israeli conflict, published by Scarecrow. Dr. Jonathan Fulton is a non-resident senior fellow of Atlantic Council's Middle East programs and Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. He also serves as an associate professor of political science at Zayed University, a good university, in Abu Dhabi. He has also written widely on this topic. He's author of China's relations with the Gulf monarchies and co-editor of External Powers and Gulf monarchies. Very interesting subject. Then, of course, you already have heard Ambassador Tirumirti, one of the finest minds in our Indian Foreign Service. He's a diplomat as a career, diplomacy as a career between 85 and 2022. He retired as permanent state representative for UN to the United Nations, a position also held by our friend Hardeep Puri. This is especially, I mentioned it because Lakshmi is here and will be dominating the evening after this. Earlier I was a secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs. Ambassador Tirumirti has served, and it's wide-ranging, Cairo, Geneva, Gaza. Gaza was particularly, I think, significant. Washington, Jakarta, and also India's High Commissioner to Malaysia, as indeed was Vijay Gokhale, who became Foreign Secretary. And he was the first representative to the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. So his experience is very, very important and even intricate. He served in various capacities in Ministry of External Affairs, including head of United Nations Division and head of division for 4 neighboring countries, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Myanmar. He was also climate change negotiator for several years. He is currently distinguished professor in IIT Madras and author of 3 books. And then my friend, Ambassador Mehmet Hasan Gogus. Hasan was the ambassador of his country Turkey in India for 6.5 years, perhaps one of the longest periods. And his president really liked him because they sent him to every difficult capital. And the most difficult capital he went was not Delhi or Athens. Relations between Turkey and Greece are not the best. His most difficult assignment, he said, was in Vienna. They still haven't forgotten the 17th century. He has also been Deputy Undersecretary. Okay. He has written on peace support operations in Turkey as the focal points in reputed journals and the Foreign Policy Journal, Turkish Policy Column. Before I end on this phase, I must give you some bad news and some good news. The bad news is Dr. Kumaraswamy will not be able to join us. There's been a last minute cancellation. The good news is the other panelists get a little more time. Okay. So why don't I begin with the Middle East, the easy one. Right. You want it? Yeah. So let's begin with the Middle East. And it actually makes a very important point, because if we don't understand the language with which we describe the world, we cannot understand it. Or we will understand it from a legacy perspective, from an inheritance perspective, which will distort the way in which we serve our interests, by meaning Indian interests in that world. You have to correct the language in order to understand the geography of the. What do I mean specifically with it? I was in Manama speaking at the conference there, their annual conference there hosted by the Bahrain government. And the subject, as you will have heard from these biodatas, everybody was on the Middle East and Middle East and Middle East. And I began by asking my very distinguished audience, I said, will you kindly let me know, we are sitting in the Gulf or standing in the Gulf, will you please let me know in the middle of which East are you? Seriously, in the middle of which East are you? Why are you the Middle East? If there is a middle of the East, it's India. If there is. You talk the Far East. And far from whom? It's not far from Delhi. So why do you call me call it Far East? Why should I join your language? Because the moment I join your language, I look from either the long distance spectacles or the myopia you bring to the subject. I want to develop my own side. My own side will enable me to have both foresight and hindsight, and all three are required in diplomacy. But at least I will be looking at the world from my own eyes, and not from the eyes of somebody with a different set of interests. I don't think I'm talking about friends and enemies. That's not the issue. We are not an enemy of the West. But we have a different view of the world, which is based on India's interests. And that's all there. And in fact, our view of the world tries its level best to be as compatible as we believe, as much with our friends. And therefore, I think we are a positive contributor to the understanding of the world. So, please, language, and I'm happy that here the theme is West Asia, although the descriptions are Middle East. As for the region that we are addressing, I'm reminded of a story which I heard in the region. His a Syrian was talking to the other and said, "Oh, there is no news from Aleppo today." And then he added, "Thank God." Because all the news from Aleppo was always bad news. So there is a history of conflict there which goes back a millennia and more. And in their conflict, is the best door to understand. If you can understand a people's humor, you will understand. And this is very intelligent humor, political. Of course, along with humor comes another snatch of conversation which I had in Beirut. And I remember this so very sharply. This was maybe 18 or 19, something to around that time, 2018, 17. And they were still discussing the Lebanon war. The Lebanon war hadn't stopped. And they said the famous saying of Lebanon was, the Lebanese war is only breakfast. The main meal will be in Syria. And eventually, after 2012, the main meal was in Syria. And it continues to be in Syria. Just as a quick recollection, from memory, not from Uncle Google, I tried to list out the number of wars in that region from 73. I came to the dirty 13, more than the 12, right? Or the baker's dozen. 67, then the PLO, upsurge, assertion, violence all around, all through the 60s. The 73 war, which actually I think is the only war which led to some status quo which has held. For 50 years it has held, and we shouldn't underestimate it. The 79, the Iran revolution, changing the whole map of West Asia, the political map of West Asia. 1980s consumed by the Iraq war, and I remember a very famous saying attributed to Henry Kissinger when he was asked that who would you prefer won the war between Iraq and Iran? He said both sides should lose. And actually, if you look at it historically, that is precisely what happened. Both sides lost. I couldn't resist now. There was another conversation with the grand old man in which I said, well, let me position your famous remark differently. That after America came to Iraq in 2004, 3, I said, who won the war between America and Iraq? Iran won them. As if you must understand why. Then after that, there's Iran, Arabia, the tensions, surrogate war, the Houthis, Gaza, Hamas. In fact, Iran, I think, has created what I called the calibrated conflict. And Iran has developed great expertise in the calibrated conflict, in which it pursues its interests very often by other means and through other forces. Just want to end on one point, intro, which is that wars in this region, and perhaps wars all over, they are fought for just 3 reasons: geography, geology, and ideology. And when all three actually boil together as they do in West Asia, then you can imagine that it can only become the war of wars. Right, on these few thoughts, we'll go to the discussion. Please.
Honorable Shri M.J. Akbar and distinguished friends, I am particularly happy to speak in this segment given my close association with the Arab world and the Middle East over the years. I was also the first Indian representative to the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, and I lived in Gaza for 2 years. In the recent past, West Asia has seen some important developments, not all of which have been positive. And I would like to dwell on 5 of these broad trends to get a better understanding of where West Asia stands. Firstly, there is a very clear desire on the part of Gulf countries that they would like to move beyond the current geopolitical constraints of the region and seek regional stability. In this, their own domestic social re-engineering and opening up had much to do with this. The Arabs, particularly the Gulf countries, were happy to be persuaded that they should have normalization of relations with Israel for regional stability and integration. And soon the Abraham Accords were signed. Now, I don't want to use the word regional realignment as the topic says, since the word realignment has a different and even adversarial connotation. Regional integration and stability probably explains the situation a little bit better, since we need to provide for security for Israel also. Normalization was the reason why the region could dream of IMEC, the corridor, and start plurilateral groups like I2U2 and others. You're aware that Saudi Arabia was already in the last stages of finalizing their deal with Israel and the US. However, the problem was that these countries also convinced themselves that normalization could happen without addressing some entrenched, unfinished historical issues in the region. The most obvious being the Palestinian issue. In fact, even actively ignoring these issues. So this regional integration process received a rude shock on the 7th of October, a shock from which the region has not yet recovered. However, I'm convinced that the process of normalization cannot be stopped, but can only be stalled, and will move forward once the so-called day after arrives in Gaza war, whenever it does. But it is equally evident that for regional stability in West Asia, a lot more has to be done to resolve these unfinished historical issues, especially the Palestinian issue. To pretend that Palestine will somehow go away or be forced to disappear through forcible eviction or voluntary exodus of Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank is not a solution. In fact, the word occupation has a direct bearing on some of the issues which we are seeing in the topic. And this includes not just occupied territories in Palestine, but also occupied Golan. Occupation of territory by foreign troops in region, for example, in countries like Syria. Secondly, the Western Israel wanted to shift the focus away from Palestine and wanted the world to believe that the main threat was actually Iran. And in many ways, the Arab world and the Gulf bought into this narrative, rightly or wrongly. But trying to isolate Iran through sanctions, trying to emasculate its economy, confronting it in different theaters, fighting against its proxies, etc., certainly hasn't produced the results the West and the Gulf had hoped for. If nothing, it has only emboldened Iran and those whom they support. Now, the West and the others are bereft of ideas how to tackle Iran, especially after the United States unilaterally abandoned the JCPOA earlier, and now with the Houthis firing missiles disrupting international trade and commerce in and around the Red Sea. On the other hand, when the Houthi missiles hit Saudi Aramco facilities inside Saudi Arabia in 2002, the Gulf countries realized the untenability of the adversarial relationship with Iran. The two adversaries, Iran and Saudi Arabia, had a rapprochement in 2023 in the case of Yemen. It is increasingly becoming clear that one cannot tackle Iran only through unilateral sanctions. There has to be a policy of engagement with Iran, something which the United States refuses to contemplate. We should be careful not to become prisoners of our own policy. Thirdly, the Islamic world itself was facing major divisions, where bigger Islamic countries indulged in a fight for the leadership of the, if I can call it, the Islamic Ummah. One saw the serious fallout in the Gulf between Qatar and the other Gulf countries. The Gulf countries started playing a bigger role in regional conflicts like in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, etc. Turkey, a NATO power, asserted itself in many hotspots. And of course, the role of Iran itself in Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, etc., which the Gulf countries fiercely countered. All this consumed much of their energy at the cost to themselves. Now there is better appreciation of the damage this intra-Islamic rivalry has done. Apart from Saudi-Iran rapprochement, which incidentally was done with China acting as a catalyst, we are also seeing Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, Iran and others taking steps to put irritants behind. Fourthly, we now have the other major players engaging the Arab countries and the Gulf. We now have China and Russia, and in addition to the United States in the region, which has given the Arab and the Gulf countries much more policy options. This has helped them to exert greater autonomy in their decision making, and they too seem to be embracing the policy of multi-alignment, which India is doing. It should not be forgotten that after the Ukraine war broke out, when the first UN Security Council resolution on Ukraine war was tabled, all the 3 Asian countries in the council abstained, including China, India, and the United Arab Emirates. Since then, more and more developing countries are exhibiting greater autonomy in their decision making, including in the Gaza war, which has only strengthened this trend. Finally, the liberal use of unilateral sanctions, waging war for regime change, occupation of territory by foreign forces, proxy wars in West Asia by P5 countries and others in the region, volatile situation in occupied territories in the West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza have all given fillip to terrorism and terrorist forces in the region, even if we all agree that terrorism can never be justified. Killing of Palestinian civilians, of which nearly 14,000 are children, is a human tragedy, and this will only radicalize future generations. The forcible takeover of power by Taliban in Afghanistan, withdrawal of the West from theaters of conflict, rise of jihadi terror in Africa and the Sahel, etc., will only result in the jihadists and Islamic radicals drawing the wrong lessons. So friends, it is incumbent on the major powers, both in the West Asia region and outside, to take a more comprehensive view of what constitutes security and peace for the region, especially for Israel, and seek permanent solutions to some of the entrenched problems that plague the region. For example, much as the world has condemned the attack on Israel by Hamas on 7th October, if we push only for a military solution to the Palestinian issue and not a political one, and if the end game is only continuing occupation of Palestine, we will only be repeating history, not shaping history. So guaranteeing security and peace for Israel and ensuring that occupation in all countries in the region ends through political solutions, these are the 2 essential ingredients for securing that elusive peace and stability which West Asia deserves. Much as we hate to admit it, Hamas has reset the Middle East. The world is rebooting, but it is not rebooting fast enough. Thank you.
He's listening. Your mention of sanctions reminds me of a former foreign minister of Iran told me, I asked him, how does Iran deal with sanctions? And he said, you can't sanction a country with 7 neighbors. And just to add a little bit to that, the sale of Mercedes-Benz cars has risen sharply in the countries neighboring Russia ever since the sanctions began. So, I request Dr. Fulton to speak.
So good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for the invitation. I've been wanting to come to Udaipur for years. It's my first chance to actually get here, so the chance to speak at this event was already very enticing, and then to do it here made it a treat. So I'm going to talk about China and the Gulf, and for the astute among you, you might recognize that I'm neither from the Gulf nor from China. I'm also not from the U.S., so my comments aren't me angling for a position in the administration. I'm actually from Canada, and Canada has 0 strategic interests in the Gulf. So this specialization really does me no favors. So I can really look at this as just a purely political puzzle, and something I've been looking at for a very long time. I spent most of my 20s in Taiwan, where I studied Chinese, and in South Korea, where of course China is a very big factor that we talk about all the time. And then in 2006, I moved to Abu Dhabi and started teaching at Zayed University. Like most people moved to the Gulf, I went there expecting I'd go for 3 years, and I was 18. It's a very sticky place. But it's interesting is when I arrived, I was the guy who had been watching China from outside for quite a while. And I thought I'd go to the Gulf and that wouldn't be the case anymore, because it didn't seem like China had much going on there. And I realized very quickly that that wasn't true. I started doing my PhD in 2010 with a focus on China's relations with the Gulf monarchies. I remember talking to somebody from Mubadala, one of the sovereign wealth funds in Abu Dhabi, saying, look, I'm working on this topic. What advice do you have? And he said, what advice? Like, stop. There's no way you can write 100,000 words on they buy oil and they sell cheap junk. Like, that's the story. But I carried on. By the time I finished and then published my dissertation as a book, the week after my book came out, Xi Jinping visited Abu Dhabi and elevated the bilateral to a comprehensive strategic partnership and made me look really smart. So, thank you, Xi Jinping, if you're listening. This topic has gotten very, very, very sexy in the past few years. A lot of it is because of this era of great power competition that the Trump administration rolled out in 2017. At that point, when they identified China as one of their great power competitors, and they started looking at China in different parts of the world, and what Washington had long seen as an American lake, it became very clear that there was a lot more going on, and that China was more than just an economic actor. It's been strange for me because my work went from being not very interesting to too many people to being very interesting. And I feel my job now is mostly trying to right-size the narratives about how people look at this, because, you know, when it suddenly became interesting to people that China was in the Gulf, they saw it everywhere. And suddenly there's all these stories. As America leaves a vacuum, China fills the void. You know, China's everywhere. China's doing everything. China's eating America's lunch. There's also this idea that China and Iran were these natural partners, natural allies, and that they work together as revisionist actors to disrupt this regional order. And because I've been living in the Gulf for so long, on the Arab side of it, and because I've been researching it, I thought that was kind of a silly notion. When you look at how many Chinese people actually live in Iran, a couple of thousand, compared to how many live in Dubai, between 300,000 and 400,000. When you look at the number of Chinese businesses on the Arab side of the Gulf, the amount of investment, contracting, trade, there's really no comparison. China does a lot of very important stuff on the Arab side of the Gulf. They do very little with Iran. Everything they do with Iran gets amplified because it's a very, very scary idea for a lot of actors. The US sees any support for Iran as a problem. Of course, the Israelis see anybody working with Iran as a problem. Curiously, when I talk to Emiratis or Saudis about it, they say this is an opportunity because we do so much strategic stuff with the Chinese, and because they get so much energy from us and they get so much contracting from us, they'll probably be more inclined to listen to us when we talk about our problems with Iran. And I think the Gulf Arabs, the Khalijis, have been really clever in creating a lot of incentives to make China kind of prefer their side of things in the Gulf, you know, by creating these low barriers to entry into Jebel Ali, to Jafsa, or to Kizad, and these different free zones. So as a result, we've seen all this Chinese movement into the region, and there's this never-ending story that America's leaving, which I think also is quite silly. And then it becomes great power competition in the Gulf. And really, when you talk to people from the GCC countries, what they'll say is, our relationship with Western countries, and in general, and the US in particular, is strategic. It's very important to us. We cooperate on security, we cooperate on politics, we cooperate on development, economics, development, all this stuff. Our relationship with China thus far is largely transactional. And to them, they'll say, this is very puzzling. What is it, Washington, about these transactions that has you so worried? We buy stuff from them, we sell stuff to them. But I think, again, this mentality of great power competition really drives a lot of neuroses in how people think about these things. So it went from being a topic nobody really thought very much about to one that people kind of exaggerated China's role. We saw this a lot, starting in December 22 when Xi Jinping went to Riyadh, and they had these 3 summits. These were seen as monumental big things. They were really continuation of stuff that they've been doing for a very long time. There was a China-GCC strategic dialogue that started in 2010. It had regular meetings until 2017 when the GCC ceased to function as a regional grouping. But this China-GCC summit in Riyadh in 22 wasn't a new thing. They'd already had, I think, 4 of these things at this point. The China-Arab States Cooperation Forum had been going on since 2002. The summit with the Arab League was a continuation of that. In the China-Saudi summit. Well, again, that's something that they've been doing since 2016, when China and Saudi signed this comprehensive strategic partnership agreement. So really, you know, what a lot of people thought was a big new thing was just the same old thing that had been going on for quite a while. But you had that, you had Raisi visited Beijing 2 months later, you had the rapprochement between Saudi and Iran, which China got far too much credit for. And then you got the expansion of BRICS, expansion of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you had Abbas visiting Beijing. Beijing invited Netanyahu to come in October. For obvious reasons, that didn't happen. You know, all this stuff looked very dramatic, that the things were changing. And then October happened, and what did China do? Not very much. They didn't have the solution, right? When you look at what China has been offering in terms of security, they keep saying there's peace through development. That's the secret sauce. That's how China transformed itself from one of the poorest countries in the world to the second biggest economy, by focusing on development and staying out of politics and great power competition, all that kind of stuff. So China says this worked for us, it'll work for you too. And that's what they've been promoting all over the Middle East, saying you don't need, you know, great power, hegemonic interference, you don't need militaries, what you need is development. And of course, when you look around, especially the Gulf, where every country's got a vision document about how to create post-hydrocarbon economies, to create new jobs for young people, to create new industries, to draw foreign investment, to make them normal countries. That's very appealing when a very rich country comes in and says, all we care about is development, you know? The flip side of that is that they don't really have anything to offer when there's an actual hard security threat. So when Hamas attacked Israel, you know, peace through development doesn't really have much to say. You actually need boots on the ground. You need, you know, you need warships in the Eastern Mediterranean. You need military support. And China didn't have that. You saw the same thing with the Red Sea shipping crisis, where, you know, China took a very mercantilist approach. At this point, I'm based in Abu Dhabi, but talking to people in Riyadh, saying that the Saudis are very upset by China's non-response, saying, look, you're our biggest trading partner, we're your biggest source of oil, you do a tremendous amount of contracting for us, you make a lot of money here. What we need more than anything is a great power that's going to support us when we need it. And instead what you're doing is nothing. You know? You're saying our ships can pass, so we're cool. So I think it's been kind of interesting. Again, like I think there's been this misreading from the start. When I think of China in the Gulf, I think it's an economic actor. I think that's it. It's there to make money, it's there to do business. If it can score points on the US, that's great. But its primary interests are not security, they're not political. First and foremost, it's there as an economic actor. And I think Gulf countries are starting to realize that. The previous speaker talked about strategic autonomy. We've heard about multi-alignment. I think when it comes down to what Gulf leaders want is extra regional powers that are going to support them when they need it. They thought that Russia looked pretty useful when they saw what they did in Syria. They kept saying, we hate what he's doing, but we love how he does it. Wouldn't it be great if we had a country to do the same for us? They thought China would be that actor, now they see it's not, and I think what they look around and they say, who's it going to be now? It's not India yet. Although, you know, there's a lot more happening in this space, but I think what they see is, yeah, this defense cooperation agreement we have with the US is what we've got. And you can see there's been a recalibration. There's an announcement in December that G42, this AI company in Abu Dhabi, was no longer going to work with Chinese tech companies. A lot of people said, oh, that's because Washington's pressuring them. Well, no, that's because they looked at it and said, Chinese tech companies aren't trusted by the Chinese Communist Party, right? If the CCP is worried about how they use their data, then maybe that's a problem for us. Also, they looked at it and said, we're richer than God. We can afford the best. If we can afford the best, why don't we go to Microsoft, which clearly for the past couple of years has proven to be the best in AI. So I think what we're seeing is a very competitive environment. You know, the alignment choices, I don't think when we talk about alignment, I understand why people think about it, but I think it's wrong. I think the Gulf states are always going to be aligned with their strategic partners, and that's going to be pretty much the US. It's not an easy relationship at all on either side, but I think it's the only great power that offers them what they need. What China offers is opportunities and trade and investment, but even the trade, and I know I'm getting the birdie whistle in a second, but even in the trade, you know, there's always the story, China's the #1 trade partner. Sure it is. In oil, China buys a lot of oil. That's all it buys. These countries are trying desperately to build post-hydrocarbon economies. They want to do more than oil. To do this, it's not about trading goods, it's about trading services. And when you see this, you'll see countries like the Europeans, like the Americans, even us Canadians, who offer, you know, training and financing and education, and all the stuff that will help them develop these new types of economies. What China does is reinforces these vulnerabilities. So it actually is, you know, it's a much more complex dynamic than it gets a lot of credit for. And I don't want to get buzzed again, so I'll stop here. But if we have time for questions, I'd love to hear some. If not, maybe over lunch or dinner we can talk. Thanks.
David of the East, but the true significance of that, we'll take time for us to find out. The photo op may or may not be as important as China makes it out to be, but in the short term, I don't know about Iran or Saudi Arabia, but China is certainly benefiting. You can see that from the Houthi announcement that Chinese ships will not be hit in the Red Sea. Right, now there will be time for questions, Dr. Fulton, so we'll use 10 to 15 minutes. Can I ask request Dr. Rubin to come online through whatever technology you have created for that? And of course, we'll have my friend Hasan, we give him the last word. Turkey demands it as a right.
I'm online. Okay, hello there. I'd like to start with a quick Russian joke, and it's about the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. The Russian pessimist is the one who says, you know, things have never been so bad. War, environment, health, economy, they couldn't possibly get worse. And the Russian optimist is the one who says, no, 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 they can always get worse. So I'm going to give a little bit of an optimistic talk today. First of all, you're a room full of experts, so I won't belabor a great deal of detail when none needs to be given. But certainly one of the big problems, which has already been referenced when we talk about terrorism in the region, is the lack of a consistent definition. According to Columbia University, just among Western security agencies, there's now more than 250 different definitions in play. And so oftentimes countries will say they're against terrorism unless implied it happens to be for a cause with which they agree. When it comes to the cause of terrorism, however, one thing I think that the West often misses, and this comes into play today with perhaps some of the reason why diplomacy isn't successful, is that we want to look at terrorism as motivated through the lens of grievance, which can be comforting for diplomats because if terrorism is caused by a grievance, you address the grievance and then the terrorism goes away. Whether it's occupation, whether it's poverty, whether it's something else. Unfortunately, that doesn't take into account the role of ideology. I note that in 1946, the United States intelligence community was charged with determining what the greatest over-the-horizon threats to world peace would be, now that Nazism, fascism, and the Japanese army had been defeated. And they came up with two. The first was communism, which was understandable given the Azerbaijan crisis at the time. And the second was Islamism. Now, this is a year before the partition of Palestine, 2 years before the creation of the State of Israel. What they were citing was the Muslim Brotherhood violence in Egypt, which was rooted solely in ideology. Now, I would disagree with previous speakers when we're looking at the region. I don't think the problem has been isolation of Iran. but rather integration given the ideology which the Iranian leadership holds. Iranian terror increased in proportion to sanctions relief. The break was not the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action because that was integrated into UN Security Council Resolution 2231 anyway, but rather the end of maximum pressure. And any look at the timeline of events reflects that. That said, I agree with other speakers that realignment is overstated. It won't last. Look, I'm an Iran watcher by training. I used to live in Iran. They used to call me in Persian, Pasadi Shaitani Bozorg. And when I saw the panic in Washington about the supposed China-Iran deal, I was pulling my hair out, because one thing that deal supposedly said was that China would take over Quiche Island in the Persian Gulf. But Quiche Island is pretty much a wholly owned subsidiary of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' economic wing. And the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps isn't going to give up its economic interests. So we'll see a lot of flashes in the pan which cause panic. But that panic oftentimes isn't warranted. Also, demographics is destiny. And one could ask whether a clock is running down given the demographic decline of China. Now, the danger here is that China, based on ideology, may believe that it has a limited window of action. But where I think US panic about China is too exaggerated is because China is an army not only of single children, but single boys. And it hasn't fought a major war because of that. China, and even elite Chinese, can't risk the deaths of the only children of the elite society in Beijing and Shanghai. Likewise, Russia can't peel Egypt away, despite valid concerns about US staying power, because it stands to lose billions. Egypt stands to lose billions of dollars because of the Houthis, and Russia can't seem to do anything to constrain the problem. Honestly, in the future, and I'm not going to go into Turkey bashing, don't worry, Ambassador, because Turkey has come into its own. It is a proactive policy that is often in dissonance with Western countries. And without putting value judgments on that, we can focus in Washington on Russia and China, but perhaps it's the growing independence of countries in the West vis-a-vis the United States that is actually much more likely to cause tension. One of my other criticisms about Washington and its perspective is that we tend to be reactive rather than proactive. We tend to exist in a single moment of time rather than look ahead. And certainly when I was in the Bush administration, I mean, everything was about the next day. It wasn't about what might happen a year or two from now. But we're entering a period of transition. In Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei is almost 85 years old. He's had cancer. He's partially paralyzed. There's going to be the first transition in more than 35 years coming soon. Likewise, Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, is in the 20th year of his 4-year presidential term. The Hamas attack on Israel had as much to do with internal Palestinian politics and jockeying for the future than it did with the Arab-Israeli conflict. And for that matter, there's going to be a transition in Israel when this war is over. There's a parallel to the 1973 war, which ultimately brought down Golda Meir when the guns fell silent. The same thing will happen to Bibi Netanyahu. The buck stops with him. That said, there are shifting centers of gravity. I mean, case in point is the Eastern Mediterranean, from the US perspective, is increasingly going to become more important than the Mediterranean. That said, and I'll start to conclude now, it is possible to snatch defeats from the jaws of victory by allowing Hamas to survive in Gaza. When people say it's a fact of life, one could argue the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia was a fact of life. But sometimes those regimes have to end. Likewise, I've spent a lot of time in Mosul in Iraq, in Raqqa, the Islamic State capital of Syria, and the urban warfare there was just as brutal, if not more, than what we see in Gaza. The only difference was it was the United States that perpetrated it. It wasn't the Islamic State that destroyed Raqqa. But when I talk to people in Raqqa and Mosul, seldom do they say they wish the Islamic State had survived. Now, I worry about precedents because oftentimes we look at the Arab-Israeli conflict as let's just solve this problem now and then things will fall into place. But if I can be particularly provocative, to reward Hamas terror with a state right now would be to encourage Khalistani terrorism and a parallel demand as illegitimate that Khalistan, if they conduct enough terrorism, should be rewarded with a state. The West is weak on this sort of thing because, again, we understand grievance more than we understand ideology. And our adversaries will take advantage of that by playing to our heartstrings. Now, I would just conclude with one issue. Before we heard that there are 3 reasons why wars happen in the Middle East. Let me disagree politely. I think a fourth reason explains much more. And that's not water, that's not oil, that's not some of the other issues, it's overconfidence. The United States is guilty of this, Hamas is guilty of this, Iran is guilty of this, I'd argue Turkey is guilty of this as well. When we are overconfident about our ability to impose through force of arms, rather than hearts and minds, we end up creating second-order effects which destabilize the region. So far, China has been much more cautious than the United States about this. But ultimately, it's recognition of overconfidence, whether we learn the lessons of the past, which I think will determine the future. And with that, I hope I've raised enough points for good discussion. Let me turn the floor back over.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin, for particularly, as far as I'm concerned, of stressing the role of ideology as one of the 3 critical elements in war in that region and perhaps elsewhere as well. As you can see from his intervention and from the discourse, while sequence can be fast-paced, even abrupt, consequence moves at a slower pace, almost as a snail pace. And we have to see the consequences before we before we understand how important was the sequence. I'm referring particularly, of course, to, as I mentioned earlier, the trilateral peace announcement brokered by China between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The regional interests won't melt that quickly. Now, for, as I said, the last word, Hasan.
Dear friend, Minister MJ, distinguished participants, before starting my presentation, just a quick response to Dr. Rubin. I don't know if he's still online. I served in also several places in Europe. I know very well that bashing Turkey sells, so we are quite used to that. Let me start by thanking officials of USANAS Foundation for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to be back in India. India has a special place in my 42 years of diplomatic career. My first post abroad was Delhi in the beginning of 1980s as a young second secretary. After 25 years in 2002, this time I returned to India as Turkish ambassador. During my postings in India, I had visited this beautiful city of Udaipur a couple of times. The difference with today is remarkable. Suffice it to say, the development of India is really incredible. Today I plan to make my presentation in 2 parts. First, I will talk very briefly about West Asia in general, and then I will try to share with you some thoughts on Turkish policy vis-à-vis Middle East. I deliberately used two different terms, namely West Asia and Middle East for the same region. I don't know, I didn't share my presentation with MJ, but I think we touched the same points. As you might already be aware, what you refer to as West Asia in this part of the world, in the West, including Turkey, is defined as Middle East. I'm not going to trigger a discussion on which is the correct terminology. One day, Nasreddin Hoca, a folkloric character, hero of short stories and satirical anecdotes, was asked the question, Hoca, according to you, where is the center of our universe? His replies was short, where I stand is the center. So Middle East, Far East, West Asia, all these concepts depend on where you look from them. Middle East or West Asia has always been the most complex and inflammatory region of the whole world. It has also been a region of strategic importance where geopolitical interests intersect and shape the course of history. One of the dramatic consequences of the First World War was the collapse of three empires, namely Ottoman, Austria-Hungarian, and the Tsarist Russia. During the Ottoman rule, the region was rather stable and quiet. After the withdrawal of Turks, Middle East became an area of rivalry for external powers. The so-called Sykes-Picot agreements, designed by the British Foreign Minister Marc Sigot and his French counterpart Georges Picot, fell short of bringing peace to the former Ottoman territories because they did not take into account the actual realities, and the borders were drawn on table, as MJ also alluded to. The creation of Israel's state on the territories of Palestine by the UN resolution in 1947 was another milestone in the Middle East, the consequences of which we are still suffering. The Arab Spring in 2011 was a transformative moment that reverberated across the region, challenging authoritarian regimes. The aftermath of the Arab Spring saw the emergence of new power centers and the reconfiguration of traditional alliances. Furthermore, the rise of non-state actors, particularly Iran and its proxies, has added another layer of complexity to the region's geopolitical dynamics. Today, the Middle East continues to grapple with the persistent threat of terrorism and extremism. Terrorist groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates have exploited social, economic, and political grievances to recruit followers and propagate violent ideologies in the name of one religion. According to true Muslim faith, to commit suicide is a sin. You are not allowed to kill yourself, let alone to kill others. I think Mr. Khanna also mentioned this aspect of Islam. Only Almighty God is entitled to give and to take back life. But what we see in the Middle East during the last decade was a tragedy. In some cases, ISIS terrorists were shouting, "God is great, Allahu Akbar," while beheading his Muslim victim, who was also crying, "God is great." This is a very distinctive example of complexity of the Middle East. In addition to the traditional state actors, the region is increasingly facing a notable proliferation of transnational groupings that operate beyond conventional boundaries. These non-state actors, ranging from armed militias to ideological movements, play a significant role in shaping the dynamics of the Middle East and often serve as a proxies for regional powers or pursue their own agendas. Now, let me turn to Turkish policy vis-à-vis West Asia. I will start with a quotation from Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of Turkish Republic. He advised the following to the newly appointed ambassadors before sending them abroad to assume their duties. First, do not interfere in the internal affairs of your neighboring countries. Second, do not provoke Russia. Third, try to develop cultural, economic, and social ties with the Arabs, but never be part in disputes among them. Fourth, do not give advice to them unless you are asked to do so. Atatürk's motto in foreign policy was peace at home, peace in the world. In line with these recommendations, Turkey has consistently avoided being part of the regional politics of the Middle East during most of the 20th century, and thus he has had a holistic approach towards the region. However, global geopolitical and domestic political changes since the end of the Cold War have brought Turkey increasingly closer to the region. Besides, although, however, unwilling, Turkey has become an important player in the Middle Eastern politics. The end of the Cold War enabled Turkey to redefine its priorities in international politics and allowed it to prioritize its economic connections within its neighborhood. Turkey began paying more attention to the region, especially after the rise of Erdogan's Justice and Development Party, GDP, to power in 2002, especially after its second term in governance in 2007. The GDP started to focus more closely on the region and spearheaded several initiatives with the regional countries. The new policy line, labeled as Zero Problem with Neighbors, put forward by the chief foreign advisor to the Prime Minister, Professor Ahmet Davutoğlu, who later became our foreign minister, mainly aimed at developing closer relations with neighbors to further economic prosperity. However, the outbreak of the Arab Spring in late 2010 distorted regional dynamics and produced new security challenges for Turkey. While its connection with the autocratic regimes undermined its ambition to become a regional power, its later policy of supporting opposition forces created further problems and uncertainties. The biggest challenge the Arab Spring created for Turkey has been the unrest in Syria. Although it was initially thought that personal rapport between President Assad and Erdogan during the previous period would give Turkey the leverage to convince Assad to ease the tension with reforms, this did not happen. Turkey then reversed its policy and started to support the opposition groups. It seemed that Turkey, having seen the regime-changing powers of popular uprisings in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, underestimated the power of Assad regime in Syria, as well as the third parties such as Russia and Iran. While Turkey initially tried to persuade the international community to intervene, global actors were not willing to do so. This led to a situation where Turkey found itself on the same side with Saudi Arabia and Qatar in assisting the opposition groups. Subsequently, the humanitarian side of the Syrian crisis became Turkey's major concern, as it has received more than 4 million Syrian refugees. Besides the obvious difficulties in taking care of large numbers without international support, the Turkish-Syrian border almost ceased to exist. From 2011 onwards, ISIS became a direct threat for Turkey. For a short period, we saw ISIS flags on the other side of our Syrian border. The city I come from, Gaziantep, is on the Syrian border, and when you sit in your balcony, you could easily see ISIS flags. The inability of Assad regime to control the northern part of the country created a heaven for different terrorist groups like PKK and its affiliates. In 2015, Turkey had to conduct 2 military operations in northern Syria to eliminate perceived direct security threats from the region. Unfortunately, the US preferred to cooperate with the terrorist Kurdish groups instead of her long-standing NATO ally Turkey. While fighting against ISIS, the continued military assistance to US, to YPG, PYD, which are part and parcel of PKK, considered as a terrorist organization both by US and EU, has further poisoned the Turkish-US relations. Turkey displayed the strongest reaction to the military coup d'etat by Sisi in 2013 in Egypt. President Erdogan even refused to sit at the same table with Sisi in New York, hosted by the UN Secretary General. It took more than 10 years to normalize the Turkish-Egyptian relations. Only last month, President Erdogan paid an official visit to Cairo, and now we expect Sisi to come to Turkey. Regarding our relations with Israel, Turkey was the first Muslim country to recognize the independent state of Israel. But since then, there have always been ups and downs in our relations. I don't remember how many times the ambassadors were recalled from Tel Aviv and Ankara. The recent war in Gaza came at a very unfortunate timing for Turkish-Israeli relations. Reciprocal steps were taken for the normalization. Prime Minister Netanyahu was supposed to visit Ankara, but after 7th of October last year, we came back to square one. Let me conclude by saying a few words about the ongoing war in Gaza. The key issue remains to be how to end the bloodshed and seek a just and lasting solution. The ongoing talks towards an immediate and permanent ceasefire, unhindered humanitarian aid to Gaza, and release of all hostages, prisoners on both sides would enable a much-needed de-escalation. Efforts for a fair and lasting solution should stick to established parameters regarding the Israeli-Palestine question. That is to stay two-state solution. I'm afraid the continuation of the present situation will only play to the hands of the radicals. The loser so far in this war is neither Hamas nor Israel, but so-called Western values and the UN, which has been unable to do anything. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of the 20th century, we all know that the consequences of the First World War created the Second. The Second World War ended with the Cold War, and the Cold War ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the fall of the Soviet Union. Second World War and Third World War ended. The First World War still continues. Now, we have time for 5 questions. I hope that the questions, that the average age of those asking the questions will be significantly lower than the average age of those on the podium. So, please, 5 questions, and from the back, please. And please, address your question to somebody specific of the speakers. That will be question number 1. Please, question number 2. At the back. Come on, raise your hands. There is no terror in asking a question. It's much easier than giving the answer. Okay, we'll have only one question.
Ambassador Tirumirti, my question is to you. You briefly talked about your terrorists, my terrorists, your terrorists, and Dr. Rubin briefly touched upon the definition of terrorism. So my question is, will us reaching a legal definition of terrorism, will it help the fight against terrorism, or will we have to just make do with working definitions put on by various agencies?
Of course, you know that we have a comprehensive for a definition, that's where our comprehensive draft, which is with the UN, it is stuck because of lack of consensus on the definition of terrorism. So that is very much there. But let me also put it this way, that there is a whole plethora of texts which have come, and I refer to one of them, which is a global counter-terrorism strategy, which is adopted every 2 years in the General Assembly. And this strategy defines how to counter terror. Now, I mean, you can't, and if you read very carefully, you will find, I mentioned it in my statement, but you may have got missed out. One of the very simple precepts is you cannot justify terror. It's a very fundamental thing. So anyone who says that, this is a terror act, but it happened because of this, is wrong. Whatever happened. So there are various certain principles which has come down over the last decade or so, where we have a better understanding of what terrorism means. Now, with the specific question of what you were asking about, whether the Hamas attack was, could be justified on the basis of the fact that, Palestine is occupied. What do you call it? Do you call it in self-defense, or do you have a right of self-defense when in a country? So these are all, it's all fine. But ultimately, we understand what terror means. And that is what is very important in a practical way.
Right. Yeah, sure. I think
Just a very small point. Of course, Mr. Tirumirti is more experienced than me, but there are two things which the international community has failed until now. First one is definition of terrorism, and the second one is UN Security Council reform. And I don't think these will go anywhere in the future as well.
Right, I think on that note, because we're running short of time as well, we'll end it since terrorism has been raised. May I just remind our very learned audience and those who are taking the trouble of listening to us that some of the most dramatic and the most world-changing events of the 20th century happened peacefully. The first, Gandhiji ended colonialism through non-violence. Apartheid ended in South Africa not by armed revolution, it ended through peace. The Soviet Union came down without a war. It ended because of peaceful demonstrations. I could continue actually,
So we
but
do have
I'm
another
not,
comment.
and
please.
that, thank you, sorry.
Before we leave for the session, we have another comment from this gentleman over here who had his hand raised. Please, just one
Yes,
minute.
but we ran out of time, as I mentioned, so that was the end, and I was told that we had run out of time. So I'm sorry, we can continue this, you can ask them when we do. Thank you.